Good evening, everyone. This is Shane Gebauer with BrushyMtnBeeFarm, and tonight we're going to talk about basic mead making. One of the nice things about mead making is oftentimes a beekeeper produces more honey than what they can either sell if they don't have an established market or consume themselves. Kim Flodham refers to this as the zucchini complex of beekeeping. That a beekeeper gets into this hobby and pretty soon they've got more honey than they know what to do with, and they sort of get discouraged. We didn't quite have that problem last year given the poorest honey crop on record, but generally speaking, mead making is an excellent way to use up a fair amount of honey. So tonight we're going to go through some of the very basics and background on mead making, and then sort of step through the creating a batch of mead. Just as some general guidelines, I think of mead making as being in two stages: the actual production portion of it, the making of the mead, and then the bottling portion of it. There's a little bit of work in between, racking and things like that we'll talk about. But generally, there's those two aspects to mead making. And each one of those, I usually figure about 2 hours for. So 2 hours to make a batch of mead and 2 hours for bottling. You can get it down a little bit, but that's what you're looking at to produce a batch of mead. One of the things, too, that I do, as you can see in this picture right here, I take index cards, punch a hole in it, and then just sort of drape a string over the neck of a carboy, and then you can sort of make it out here, the date in which I've produced the mead, the mead itself, what style I'm making this. You can just barely make out maybe that it's a dry mead, and then the recipe that I'm using, the type of yeast, if I'm using a varietal honey, what type of honey I'm using, things like that, the size of the batch. And then over here, I'll put, where'd my cursor go? There it is. Over here, I'll put things that I've done. So I've racked it, I've added oak chips, I've added fruit, whatever the case may be. That information will go on this side of the card. And then this, later on, you'll see I save these cards. One, so I have a recipe index. And two, when it goes to storage, I just hang this on a bottle in my wine rack, so that I know what type of mead those bottles are, the recipe, some information about it, age, things like that. And I can also take notes on flavor and characteristics and what things I like, what things I don't about this honey. So this is a great way to sort of keep your notes. And that's a very important part of mead making, because mead making is sort of a wild science, if you will. Each batch, you'll find, is going to turn out just a little bit different than the others. The honey will have a different flavor. It might have a different sugar content. It might be wildflower this time. It might be sourwood next time. Those will drastically alter the characteristics of your mead. And so these are things that we'll talk about a little bit as we go through. Before we get into sort of the meat of this, I'd just like to know sort of where people are coming from, and let's try this first. I've got a poll here. I'm going to launch a poll. If you could just take a second or two to respond to this poll. Have you ever tried mead? Yes, you loved it. Yes, but it wasn't my favorite. Or no, I've never tried mead before. Just take a bit to respond back to that. I've got almost 90% of you responding in. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Last chance. Here we go. All right, I'll close that. Let me just show you the results here. We've got 33% saying that they've tried it and loved it. 19%, so just about 20, said yes, but it wasn't your favorite. And almost half of you out there have never tried mead. What I would suggest to the 48% of you that have never tried mead is try and track down a couple bottles and try them. Before you make an investment on equipment, before you make a time commitment to this, try a couple bottles of mead and see whether it's for you. I found that people sort of fall in two camps. They either love it or they hate it, sort of opinion. So try it before you go down this road and waste a lot of money and time. Now that said, don't just try one bottle. As an example, I happened to walk into a wine store one day, and of course I always look for mead when I'm in there, and I found a bottle, and it was a type of mead where they add spices and herbs to it. And I bought it. This is from a commercial meadery. So you would think that that they would have their act together and produce a decent bottle. Well, I tried this, and I can say that it's a rare occasion when I dump a bottle of mead. Well, that one ended up going down the drain. So if that happened to be the bottle of mead that you tried, and that was your experience, obviously you would think it's not for you. But you try several different types from several different meaderies. If you can, it might take a little bit of hunting. Mead's not a very common thing to find in your wine stores. But try a sweet mead, try a dry mead, try one that's got fruit, and see if it's something that you'd like. I really enjoy it because it's an experiment. Like I said, everyone turns out a little bit different. So I'm going to go ahead and hide these. And now I've got another poll for you. I assume this is really geared toward the 50% that have tried mead, and that is, have you ever made mead? Presumably, if you've made it, you would have tried it. So the 48% that have never tried it, I'm assuming, have never made it. So let's just see where people fall here. If you could go ahead and respond. We've got just about 90%. I'm going to close the poll in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm closing that poll now. I'll close that and I'll show you the results. So we've got just about, well, 17% said yes, 83 said no, and most of you cast a vote there. So most of you have never made mead. So let's hope that we'll get some good information into you and get you up and running. All right. Thank you for that. Oop, I better share those. Let me hide those results, get those out of the way. All right. So let's talk about some of the basic ingredients in making mead. Mead, of course, is honey wine. You've got your water, you've got your yeast, and you've got your honey. Those are the three fundamental ingredients. Technically speaking, you could make mead with just those three ingredients, and they have for years and years. Mead is thought to be one of the oldest fermented beverages, rivaling beer and wine. People have been producing mead, whether intentionally or not, since they've been foraging for honey. And so it has been around quite a while, and this is the three basic ingredients that people have used to produce that product. And usually in way back when, it was wild yeast. We didn't have cultivated strains that were isolated and pure. It was wild yeast that may have been in that honey. Yes, there is yeast in honey. It's just that the moisture content typically is low enough that the yeast can't reproduce. So you add a little water. Now there's water for the yeast. They begin to reproduce, and lo and behold, you end up with alcohol. So with water, you want good, clean water. If you have, if you're in on city water and you can taste chlorine in your water, you probably don't want to be using that water. You want to find some spring water or well water. Up here on the mountain, we're on a well. It produces a good quality mead, but that chlorinated water will impart off flavorings, and so you want to try and avoid that if you can. If you've got a faucet filter that removes a good portion of that, you can certainly try it. But you'll be much better off if you can find somebody with a well or using some spring water. The yeast, there are a lot of different strains of yeast out there that you can use, and each strain of yeast is going to impart different characteristics to your mead. Some will have higher alcohol thresholds. Some have different flocculation characteristics, and flocculation just simply means how well it sort of clumps together and settles out of the liquid. They will produce different off flavorings that will impart characteristics to the final product. They may have different pH thresholds. They may be able to, some may tolerate liquids that are a little bit more acidic than others. Some may be able to tolerate higher sugar content. If you put yeast, you think yeast uses sugar, so you would think if you just threw it in with some sugar, it would go crazy. Well, actually, if the sugar content's so high, they may actually go dormant because of the concentrations of sugar. So there are a lot of different types of yeast, and I'll touch on this just a little bit when we get to the actual production stage of our mead making. And then, of course, the honey. And as I've already alluded to, the type of honey is going to tremendously affect the final product. If you've got a very mild honey, of course, you're going to end up with a very mild mead, which might be good if you're mixing in, say, raspberries with that, because you'd want the floral and character of those raspberries to sort of shine through. And if you ended up with a very robust, if you started rather with a very robust honey, very robustly flavored honey, say buckwheat, you would end up with you would end up masking the raspberry character. So you want to think about that when formulating your recipe as well. But generally speaking, any honey will do, but just recognize that if you start with a clover honey this time, but a blueberry honey the next time, or that buckwheat honey, that you're going to end up with two very different products. Even if you use the same yeast, the same recipe, the same steps, everything else the same, you will end up with two very different meads. Other ingredients that you can add, we've got fruit, which are called melomels. You've got grapes, so you mix in wine grapes and actually make mead made with some grape juice in there. Those are piments. Apples, you can mix in spices and herbs. You can mix in acids, which sort of add to the what they call the mouthfeel at the end when you're drinking it. It adds a little bit of texture in your mouth. Energizers and nutrients. These are actually something that when I first started making mead, I didn't really toy around with too much, but I've really come on board with using energizers and nutrients, largely because honey doesn't have a lot of the necessary stuff that yeast needs to reproduce and thrive. And so that's what these energizers and nutrients are. It gives the yeast stuff that they need to reproduce, which is sort of the first stage of fermentation. These yeast you put in this tiny little packet, well, those yeast just start reproducing like mad and then slowly transition to the fermentation aspect. So they need the nutrients to reproduce, and then they need nutrients to sort of continue with the fermentation. And then also tannins, again, with that sort of adds to the overall character of the mead. And these are sort of things usually, the tannins and the acids, they're usually added later on in the process. You can also, if you don't have an oak barrel, which many of us don't, you can sort of mimic the oak aging process by adding oak chips. You can get toasted oats. You can get finely shaved toasted oats, toasted wood chips. You can get Hungarian oak chips, French oak chips, American oak chips, all these different things that will impart a certain characteristic to that honey. To that mead. These are all additional things that you can eventually sort of experiment with. The equipment that you're going to need, the best way is getting a kit. And this is the kit that we've got in our catalog. It comes with this big bucket here that you can use as a primary fermenter and also as a bottling pail. You can see the spigot right here coming out that you can use for bottling. It comes with a glass 6-gallon carboy tubing to connect to the spigot for bottling. This what they call a racking cane, which is this piece right here, a corker, corks. It comes with some sanitizer, a piece of equipment called a hydrometer, which we'll get to in a little bit when we talk about specific gravity. You can see right down here, this is a little thermometer that sticks on to the pail or the glass carboy. And then this right here, which is your bottling wand. And we'll see a picture of that in a second. So this gives you the basic equipment that you need to sort of get up and running. Some other things that you'll need, maybe additional carboys. I actually don't ferment in plastic anymore, just because over time what happens is as you're cleaning, you sort of scratch it. Those scratch are tiny little cavities that bacteria can hide in, and bacteria are our enemy when it comes to honey, or when it comes to mead production. They will spoil a batch of mead, and there's nothing worse than having a spoiled batch of mead. So I've actually replaced all my plastic pails with glass carboys, which gets a little difficult when I'm adding things like plums or peaches or something like that to my meads to make a melomel, because getting those fruits down the neck of a carboy, more importantly getting them out when I'm ready to clean it, is a bit of a challenge. But I still find I can sanitize my equipment a little bit better. One of the things that you'll want is a nice big pot. This is a 5-gallon stock pot that my brother gave to me for Christmas one year. If you can find a 5-gallon pot, that'd be great. And you want stainless. That's an important thing because of the pH of the honey is quite low, meaning it's very acidic, and so you want that stainless steel so that it doesn't react with the honey. If you can certainly use a smaller stock pot. 5 gallons is just nice because I don't have to worry about things boiling over or bubbling over with this. It gives me enough space at the top to make it easy enough to work. Bottles, excuse me. Bottles, certainly if you're drinking wine now, start cleaning up those bottles and saving them, and you can reuse them. You can also buy bottles. You can use beer bottles and get beer caps and get a beer capper and use beer bottles. You can use just about any type of bottles as long as it's got a good tight seal, either with a cork or a cap. You want something that's going to seal well so that you can age your meads accordingly. And then I really recommend The Complete Mead Maker. This is a fantastic book. It's very easy to read. I'll tell you that I'm not a big book reader. I like short and sweet. I was able to get through this. I've read it a couple times now, and each time I'm able to get through it in just a few hours. It's really good. It covers the basics. It covers the history of mead. It goes through the ins and outs. It's a little science oriented, but that's good because you need this, because there's a bit of science in mead making, and so I do recommend this book for people that are interested in getting started. And we'll talk a little bit more about some different pieces of equipment here as we go through. And as I mentioned, we've got just a little bit of science involved, and so we just need to sort of move on here to our science. And this is not really technical here at all, but the basics are yeast. The yeast need to reproduce. The yeast needs sugars as a food source, and as a result, they produce alcohol and carbon dioxide as a waste. This is where those yeast energizers and yeast nutrients come into play. Because again, one of the key ingredients or nutrients in the must, which is that liquid of that mixture of water and honey, is called must. That mixture does not have adequate amounts of nitrogen in it for the yeast to be able to do the reproduction that they need to produce. And so if you don't add some of these nutrients and energizers, you won't have sufficient nitrogen. Your yeast won't be able to reproduce successfully, and you may end up with a prolonged, or what we call a stuck fermentation, where it sort of stalls. And if that happens, what happens then is the yeast can begin to sort of break down, decompose, and that creates off flavorings in your final product. So what you want right from the onset, when you pitch your yeast, you want them to start working and just chug right through to the very end. And you don't want them to sort of have to limp along because they're starved of the necessary nutrients that they need. Generally speaking, about 1 pound of honey will add about 1 pound of alcohol to a 5-gallon batch. Now, I put in here Mead calculator. At the end of this, I'm going to go out to a website and I'm going to show you a fantastic resource that will help you formulate batches, your own recipes for the future. Now, because what if you're doing a 6-gallon batch? This rule of thumb won't apply. What if you're adding grapes, or grape juice, which has sugar content? This rule won't apply. And so this Mead calculator can help with that. It won't solve all your questions or answer all your questions, but it will help with that. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is specific gravity. And specific gravity is simply a measure of the amount of sugars in that liquid. And this is a very important measure to know. Recently I had someone that works here come up to me and say, how do I know when my batch of mead is finished fermenting? And I said, well, you've got to know a little bit about the yeast that you put in there, because again, the yeast have certain alcohol thresholds. Let's say you add enough sugar that in theory, if all of it was converted to alcohol, you'd end up with an alcohol content of, say, 16%, which is very, very high. Let's say it would be 16%, but maybe the yeast you're using can only tolerate 14% alcohol. Well, you've got then that 2% of residual sugar. And so if you're testing your specific gravity is going to say, hey, there's still sugar here that can be fermented, but if you don't know what you started with in terms of your sugar content and in terms of the yeast strain, you don't know if your yeast has sort of hit that threshold and just won't do any more no matter how much time you give it, no matter how much more nutrients you give it, it's just not going to do any more. Or you don't know if you've got a stuck fermentation, which maybe when you go to bottle that agitation sort of reinvigorates things and you end up blowing corks in your wine room, which has never happened. It can happen. So you need to know what yeast you're starting with and how much sugar you've got in there. And the specific gravity is that measure. And that's that piece of equipment. Let me scroll back up here. Right here, this is called a hydrometer. And this will measure your specific gravity. And I've got a close-up picture of that here in the next couple of slides. That will measure your specific gravity. And then in terms of knowing your alcohol threshold, or the alcohol threshold of the yeast, the Complete Mead Maker has a lot of the most popular strains of yeast listed. It gives the alcohol content. We also try and list the alcohol thresholds for the yeast in our catalog if you're getting them from us. Most places that you might be shopping with can either answer that for you or should have it listed. Or if you're interested in trying a yeast, you can always Google it and you find that information out there on the web. Let's make a batch of medium mead. A medium mead would be a semi-sweet batch of mead, not dry, not sweet, semi-sweet. And I always make a 6-gallon batch. I made the mistake of making a 3-gallon batch one time because I have a couple 3-gallon carboys in case I want to do blends. Well, I made a 3-gallon batch and it turned out absolutely wonderful. And I really regretted not having the additional 3 gallons had I made a full 6-gallon batch. So I always make a 6-gallon batch. So here's a basic recipe that you can use for a 6-gallon batch. We're going to use about 17 pounds of honey, and I have to say that I as much as I'm a bit of a science geek, I tend to cut corners here. So you should do as I say, not as I do. I'm not a real stickler. You know, I produce mead for my own consumption. If I get a good one, I may enter it into a competition. But generally, I'm not interested in doing things like that. If you are interested in competing, you want to follow the directions and instructions fairly closely for the recipe you've created. But I sort of work with the rule of thumb that about there's about 12 pounds of honey to a gallon of honey. So here, 17 pounds, that would be just shy of about a gallon and a half. So because I don't have a scale that goes up beyond 11 pounds. So I'd have to measure it out twice, and measure out 11 pounds, then measure out 6 pounds. It just gets a little messy, a little time consuming. So I do it by volume, which, affects my recipes a little bit, but, that's okay for me. So I'll measure out just shy of about a gallon and a half to get my 17 pounds of honey. And in this one, I'm using the D47. This is a fairly common yeast for mead production. It tends to has a high rate of flocculation. It precipitates out fairly well, but it needs some of these nutrients and energizers. Because it doesn't have fairly high nitrogen requirements. So we're going to add in about 6 teaspoons of yeast nutrient and about 3 teaspoons of yeast energizer. And that's the recipe that we're gonna follow. So how to go about producing this batch of mead. The first thing, we're going to bring about a gallon and a half of water to a boil. And here's a well, we'll get to that in the next slide. So we're going to bring a gallon and a half of water to a boil. And while we're waiting for that water to boil, because a watch pot never boils, we're gonna hydrate our yeast. You don't have to hydrate your yeast, but if you've ever made bread or something like that, most recipes say, dissolve your yeast in about a half a cup or a cup of warm water. And it just sort of gets them up and running. It removes that stage. It removes that time that they need to do if you pitch them right into your must. So I like to hydrate my yeast, and to do that, you can see over here. First off, an empty glass, which is a big no-no when you're making a batch of mead. Always have a full glass of mead. But I've got just a wine bottle. And down here's, I've put in, that's probably a little more than a cup of lukewarm water, but about a cup of lukewarm water and a couple teaspoons. Again, I tend not to be real specific with my measurements here, but a couple teaspoons of honey just to give it the yeast a little bit of sugar. And I've got an airlock on it just to keep it, clean, and so I don't have dust falling down in there and bacteria falling down in there. And this airlock, all it does is, the bubbles will come up. It'll sort of go up over a little lip and they have to sort of perk through some water to get out. So that perking through the water prevents stuff from going back down into the bottle. So I just use a sanitized wine bottle to do this. And it takes about 15 to 20 minutes to sort of get to the stage where you start to see stuff foaming up. The yeast are good and rehydrated. And that's about how long it's going to take you to bring that gallon and a half of water to a boil. And also while you're doing this, you can be sanitizing your fermentation vessel, your primary fermenter. Your primary fermenter, if you're using that kit, will be that plastic pail. And primary because it's the first one you're going to use. And you can sanitize that. And it comes with some sanitizers, stuff called Be Bright, which is a non-chlorinated base product that will kill off the bacteria. Again, bacteria is your enemy. Sanitation is the most important part of making a good batch of mead. If you get some contaminant in there, it'll just wreak havoc and really lead to some disappointing results. So make sure everything's good and clean. So now preparing the must. To boil or not to boil. Here's where we have a large divide in mead makers. there's a fraction of mead makers that absolutely say when you add your honey to that water, you should boil it. And what will happen is as you're boiling it, it will begin to foam, and you skim that foam off because that will get rid of some things that will cause cloudy, some of the cloudiness in a final mead once it's bottled. It'll also make sure that it's good and sterile so you don't have any sort of bacteria in there that may cause some problems. But then you've also got this other group of people that say don't boil. Because here's the thing, right? When you're standing over the stove and you're doing any sort of cooking and you're stirring something and it's simmering or boiling along and you take a deep breath, what do you notice? You notice the odor. And that odor is being driven off because of the heat. Well, the same would happen if you were to boil your honey. I forget the actual temperature. I think it's like 140 degrees. At 140 degrees, a lot of the compounds in honey that contribute to the sort of floral tones that you can taste in honey actually begin to volatilize. So if you're boiling your water, which is boiling points 212 degrees, right? So if you're boiling your water, you're well above that 140 degree temperature, so you're driving off a lot of the compounds that contribute to the floral nature of the honey. And therefore, you're also driving off those floral characters that will contribute to your final product of your final mead. And that's something that, as you get into this, you'll really begin to appreciate. If you're using a blueberry honey to make a mead that has a hint of that blueberry floral character, the last thing you'd want to do is boil it to drive off the very character that you want remaining in your final product. So as you may have noticed, based on my commentary here, I tend to be in the not boil camp. So what I do is I boil my water, I take it off the heat, and then at that point, the water is pretty much sterile, it's been boiling, and then I'll add my honey to it and stir it up. The honey, while going into hot water, brings that temperature down fairly quickly, and I preserve a lot of sort of the subtleties, the subtle characters of that honey, and therefore keep them so they remain in my final product. So I boil the water, take it off the heat, I add my honey, I add my nutrients and energizers, and then I stir it up to make sure it's good and mixed. I'm going to let that cool a little bit because I don't want to pour hot liquid into my glass carboy. But what I'm also going to do is I'm going to take about 3 gallons of water and put it in my fermentation vessel. Now remember, we're making, and notice that I'm using my glass carboy. And here's the thermometer on that glass carboy. And of course a funnel to make hitting that tiny little opening a little easier. Now, keep in mind we were making a 6-gallon batch. We boiled a gallon and a half, and we're adding about a gallon and a half of honey. So I boiled a gallon and a half of honey, that's 3 gallons, and now I'm adding 3 gallons of cold water to my glass carboy here, my fermentation vessel. That's a total of a 6-gallon batch now that I've got going. Be careful when you're handling that must because, of course, it's warm, it's got lots of honey, it's going to be sort of sticky, so if you spill it on yourself, it's going to burn quite badly. So be careful as you're transporting it. You may be able to see, you may not, that I've got this in my bathtub, which my wife just loves. But I've got this in my bathtub so that if I do happen to slopper over a little bit, you know, it's easy enough to sort of hose it down. Something you want to keep that in mind, or be prepared to mop your floor because it will splatter a little bit as you're pouring and things like that. And as you know, honey's quite sticky. So be prepared to have just a little bit of splashing, and be careful as you're handling that warm must. So we've got the combination now of our 3 gallons of water and our 3 gallons of must going into this. we're going to wait for the temperature of the must to reach about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. Now here's that hydrometer. The hydrometer comes in a little tube, which you can use as a testing tube, so you don't have to fill up a large glass or something with your must and waste it. This uses just a small amount of must, and this is my scale. This is the specific gravity scale. This is actually from a different batch of Mead than the recipe that I've given, so the scale doesn't match up. But here, my specific gravity, it actually ended up being a little bit lower than this, but this is down at about right now it's reading about 1.15. You can see it's got a little bit of foam right here. Once I sort of dislodged those bubbles, it read just a little bit less. But when you drop this down into it, what you want to do is sort of spin it, because that will throw the bubbles off this the hydrometer, and it'll give you a more accurate reading. So this one's got about 1.15. Your specific gravity will be around 1.103. But again, it depends a lot on the honey. It depends a lot on the sugar content. It could vary quite a bit. But this is your starting gravity. And you need this number to know whether or not your yeast will, what your ending gravity should be based on what your yeast you're using. Okay? The other thing that is not on this slide that I like to do is I try to oxygenate my must. I've got a special beater that has little wings that fold up so that it can slip down inside the neck of a carboy, and then once down in there, they sort of fold back down again. And it's a great mixer to sort of agitate that must. One, to make sure that my must, which was 3 gallons, is evenly distributed through the 3 gallons of pure water that were in there, so that now I've got a homogeneous mixture of 6 gallons of must, but also to add that oxygen, because the yeast need oxygen for that reproductive stage. A lot of times when we think of alcohol, whether it be wines or beers or something like that, we think, well, we've got to keep the oxygen out because that causes it to go stale or spoil. Well, that's true, but not in the preparation of it, not in the production of it. We want that oxygen in there because the yeast need it to reproduce. So I agitate it. You can do this by sloshing the bucket. Some people actually get special, they're similar to the little filters, the little aerators that you put in fish tanks, and will actually blow air that way to sort of add oxygen to the must. That's a bit extreme, but if you agitate it enough just to try and get air into it, that's going to help you out. And then you're going to pitch your yeast. You're going to add your yeast to this liquid, and fermentation should begin within about 24 hours. 24 to 48 hours, you should see bubbles coming up through that airlock. And the other thing to keep in mind, so you do want that airlock, but also if you put that airlock on that carboy or on that bucket when, say, the temperature's at 80 degrees and that must cools down to, say, 65 degrees, it's essentially going to create a vacuum. And so it could actually pull water up through the airlock down into the must. So I always sanitize my airlocks as well and make sure that I put good clean water inside those airlocks just in case that vacuum is formed before fermentation starts, and the carbon dioxide creates positive pressure inside there and starts to push air out. So you want to make sure your airlocks are sanitized before put in place on your fermenters. And then you'll also want to keep an eye on that too as you begin to age, bulk age, if you're aging them in your fermenter, that you don't get large fluctuations in temperature in your wherever you're fermenting that may create that vacuum as well. The next step after fermentation is something called racking. And remember, in that kit we have what they call a racking cane or a racking wand. You can see down here at the bottom, it's got a special little tip, And all that tip does is it sort of helps hold it up off the bottom so I don't suck up all the what they call lees, which are all these the spent yeast that's fallen out of solution. So you want to rack it. And you want to get it off of this because, again, as these sit there and sort of begin to decompose and break down, they'll create off flavorings. And in some cases, depending on your style and what you're doing, those off flavorings might actually be desirable, but in some cases they may not. And so you want to most often get them off of the lees. And to do that, gravity. You're just creating a siphon. So I've got my carboy up here. You, again, note my recipe. I've got my racking cane in, and just a simple siphon coming on down to this one, thermometer on this one, and I'll just make sure I transfer my recipe onto this when I put this back into my wine room where I'm fermenting. So racking is the transferring of your mead. Really, at this point, transferring your must, but at this point, it's more mead than it is must because you've got a good portion of alcohol in there. It's a good time to sample. It's going to be carbonated, but it's a good time to sample. But the racking is the transferring of your solution, whether it be must or mead, from your primary fermenter to your secondary or even your tertiary or your bottling vessel, whatever the case may be. But it's the transferring of one vessel to the next is what's considered racking. And what I do is, so this racking should occur at about 2 weeks, I would say, after you've started your fermentation. So you've pitched your yeast, and after about 2 weeks, you'll want to rack it off the lees into another into your second fermenter. And again, you should probably test your specific gravity. You'll see that it's gone down. It won't be at 0 yet, or at 1, which is pure water, but it should be going down. And I often bulk age my meads. And all that means is I'm aging my meads in these large vessels. And the reason for that is twofold. If I go to this next slide, here is a carboy, and notice the level of my solution. It's right up to the top. So the only possible air that could come in contact with my mead is just this small little pocket right here. So my surface area of mead exposed to air, potentially air, is much less in a large vessel like this than if I were aging in bottles, in actual wine bottles. The other reason why I bulk age is because I have found that once in bottles, it's too easy to consume, and thus the mead never reaches maturity. So it's best if you can leave it in a large vessel like this so that you can actually get it to an age where it begins to really come into its own. Meads take, someone once said it takes about a year for just a plain old mead to start to get good. I think that might be a little long, but it does take several months of aging for a mead to really begin to develop. And if you're adding fruits and spices and herbs and things like that, it's going to take even longer. That same person told me that if you're doing a melomel, which is a mead with fruit, you can really figure about 2 years. And here's another little story that I'll share with you. I made a blueberry mead once, and I wung it, and I didn't really follow a recipe like I should have, and I added way too many blueberries, and so the flavor was really quite terrible, actually. Well, I moved. When was that? It was probably about 6 years ago. And so the blueberry mead was about 6 years old at that point. And I figured, well, I'll try one of these bottles before I go through the hassle of moving them all and see how it is, because it wasn't worth a hoot about 2 years after I had bottled it. So let's see if it's any different now. Well, it's really quite good, and I've got 2 bottles left, and I'm actually saving them. And now those bottles are probably closer to 8 years old. And this talk has inspired me, so I have plans to go home after this and pop a cork on one of those bottles just to see what it's like. But my point is that aging can change the character of your product tremendously. And so if you bottle up a 1-month-old mead and pop the cork on it and taste it and think, oh gosh, that's terrible, don't be hasty. Don't take those bottles and start to dump them. Let them, just put them off into a corner somewhere and let them sit there for a while and go back and revisit them. Make some notes so that you know why you didn't like it, what flavors you didn't like. So when you go back to it, say a year or 2 or 3, or in my case 8 years later, you can say, oh, I'm not getting that at all now. I'm getting this. And I think you'll find with time they'll go through a tremendous transformation. So don't be hasty and dump your batches if you think that they've gone awry, because you just never, ever know. That's the advantages of bulk aging, is that you don't consume them prematurely. So bulk aging also, you should be verifying a stable gravity. And here's where, again, knowing your yeast, knowing your sugar content to begin with, will help you with this. If you added enough sugar that, in theory, if all of it was converted to alcohol, to have a 10% alcohol content, and you added a yeast that had an alcohol threshold of, say, 14%, in theory, that yeast should use every little bit of available sugar, and you'll end up with a dry mead. In which case, that means that your ending, your final specific gravity, should be sort of what you see right here, below 1. This is 1 right here. Pure water has a specific gravity of 1.000. And right now, with this mead that I'm testing, this is from a batch, not the medium mead that we're making here, but from another batch of dry mead, and it ended up with a specific gravity of 0.0998, which means all my available sugar has been consumed, and so the chances of me blowing corks in my wine room are just about nil. Now, if you've added more sugar, then your yeast will be able to utilize, because of their alcohol threshold, this final gravity will help you with that too, because you will be able to say, well, I added enough sugar for, going back to our previous example, 16% alcohol, but my yeast can only tolerate 14%. I should have a 2% residual sugar, and you can get that from your hydrometer here. So if your hydrometer is saying that you've got about 2% residual sugar, and you see that stable gravity, not just once or twice, but over time, you want to test it at least twice, preferably 3 times, and you get the same reading 3 times, chances are you're safe. You may want to add a little bit of potassium sorbate, which helps retard fermentation, just in case. That will help you from blowing corks in your wine room. It won't guarantee it. And you also might want to add some clarifying agents like sparkleoid, which is a positively charged compound. So if you add it to your mead, it will bond with the negatively charged and precipitate out. Bentonite is negatively charged, so it will bond with positively charged and precipitate out. I made the mistake one time and just in haste throwing both of these in at once, but of course, what do you think happened? They bonded to each other, and I still had a hazy mead. And you may have a little bit of haze, and that's, from my point of view, that's okay. If you're judging, if you're entering it in to be judged into a competition, they will deduct points if you've got haze in there. But, it's not going to harm you. If anybody's ever made beer out there, you get a little bit of yeast settling on the bottom of your bottles if you carbonate in the bottle. It's not going to kill you. It's the same with this. You'll just end up with a little bit of sediment in your bottle. It's not going to kill you. But if you're entering into a competition, they will deduct points for that. Let's talk about getting these into our mead now into bottles. So now we're in my kitchen sink. Here's a little piece of equipment that's nice. This is a bottle washer. Hooks up to my faucet. It's got a little switch of sorts that when you push the bottle down onto this, it sprays water up into the bottle. And I'm just sanitizing my bottles here with a little sanitizer. You can see my bottling wand down there, and here's my tubing that I've gotten here. And here's my system over here. I've got my Mead. You can see my card, and I'm siphoning down into my bottling pail. Here's the spigot. Notice here's a couple things. I've got just a casserole dish turned upside down here at the bottom, just to keep that faucet away from the ground. I don't want it touching the ground and picking up bacteria from the floor. And then also I can use this for bottling purposes. You'll see that in a second, because again, you're going to spill a little bit. It's just the nature of it, and so you want to be prepared for that. So you want to sanitize your bottles. You want to rack into a bottling pail using gravity to help you. And here's that bottling wand in action. And here you can just make out, I've sort of chopped my photo a bit, but you can just make out that casserole dish right here. And so I put now my bottles into that dish just in case I overflow a bottle. It goes into the dish rather than onto the floor. Just keeps things a little neater. This bottling wand, what it does is when it's down in the bottle, the tip is spring-loaded. So you've got to push it against the bottom to get the liquid to flow down through. But the wand has a volume associated with it. So when you retract it from a full bottle, like this one's filled right up to the neck, when you pull it up, notice what happens. The level of Mead drops right down in the bottle to where it should be for corking. So it's a really nice thing, right? You don't have to worry about trying to get it in just the right spot. You just push it down, you wait for it to fill up, pull it up, and when you get it out of the bottle, it's reduced the volume in the bottle sufficiently for corking. Okay, so that's the bottling wand. And now here's another. The kit comes with a corker. I've been doing this for a while, so I invested in a floor corker, which makes it quite nice. I should actually thank my father. He helped me with all this over the Christmas holiday, take pictures and everything. This is him corking a bottle of my Mead. Frankly, I think he really enjoyed the sampling aspect of it and would volunteer again in a heartbeat, but still, nonetheless, I appreciate his assistance. But you want to cork it. Again, here's that level right where it ought to be in a bottle of wine or Mead. And then just take a damp rag and sort of clean up these bottles, because I may have slopped over the edge a little bit. There may be a little bit of sanitizer on the outside of the bottle, and you just want to wipe that up to get it clean. Then what you're going to do, now that you've got it bottled, is you want to store it. You want to leave your bottles upright for about 24 to 48 hours. And that way, if you do have a little bit of sediment that accumulates in that bottle, it will settle down to the bottom, and then you can turn it on your edge. What some people actually do is invert the bottle so it settles onto the cork, and then when they pop the cork, some of that comes out of the solution on the bottom side of the cork. There's little tricks like that. But here's just a wine rack that I made, and again, you can see my cards sort of hanging off, telling me what each flavor is. So this one I think is my dry Mead, and this is a combination. This is a sweet rhubarb Mead. I've got a peach Mead right here. I've got another rack on a wall over here. Plus I've got right now I think I've got like 30 gallons of sweet dry plum, and another one going right now. But now for aging, what's more important than the optimal temperature? You always hear about aging in caves because the temperature, it's just the right temperature. Well, that's great. If you have a climate-controlled room, fantastic. I suspect many of us don't, but that's great if you do. I don't, but I do have at least a thermometer over here so I can sort of see what's going on. But what's more important than the optimal temperature is a consistent temperature. Because what will happen is there's a little bit of air in each one of these bottles, right? If I go back up to this picture, I've got air in there. And that air will expand and contract with temperature fluctuations. And so if it gets cold, it will try and suck air in through the cork. And if it does that, it has the potential of bringing in contaminants it also has the potential to bring in oxygen, and then when it expands, it actually may begin to force the corks out, which isn't good either. So the bottle may sort of breathe like that, and you don't want that. So almost what's more important than the aging at the optimal temperature is just having one that's consistent. So in this case, this room is actually a spare closet that I've taken over, and it's actually got a heating duct over in a corner. So in the wintertime, a little bit of warm air comes into here, and in the summertime, a little bit of cool air from the air conditioner comes in here. So it stays fairly constant, which is nice. And then, of course, you want to have it fairly humid so that your corks don't dry out and allow oxygen in there or leakage. Ideally, you want about 55, 57 degrees with about, I think it's about 70% humidity. That my room here runs at about, it runs at about 70 degrees, honestly, I'm not quite sure what my humidity is. And then the final stages of all of this, of course, is to consume. We must consume our product. And again, here's the, don't be hasty. Let that mead age and mature. I like to add oak chips to mine, to my meads, and that oak character really takes a while to sort of to become a little more subtle and less overbearing. And so right now, my favorite mead in my closet is a dry mead that I made probably about 3 years ago, and I'm getting a little nervous because I've only got about 6 bottles left, and I'm cherishing them. But that gives you an idea of sort of the time frame. And so that's another reason why I've got about 30 bottles in carboys right now, or 30 gallons rather in carboys, is because I like to have a backstock going. And also, my wife and I just had a baby, so she hasn't been drinking, so it's a good opportunity to stockpile because it won't be long before she starts popping the corks again. So I need to get a little backstock going. So don't be hasty. Let that mead age and try it over time. Don't dump them out if you find you don't like it. Let it age and see what happens. And I think you'll be surprised at how it sort of comes into its own. Let me, let's see here. Let me pull up my questions panel here. That's the last. Oh, that's right. I was going to take you out to that calculator. I'm sorry. Let me get out of this and come back to here. So we've, on our website, I've already got the link pulled up, but just so you know where to find it, if you go to our resource section, and it's going to run a little slow here because I've got the webinar taking up some bandwidth. We go to our links, and then there's, here it is, Got Mead. This is a fantastic website. And here's the website. This is the home page, gotmead.com. All sorts of information over here. And right here, this Mead calculator, which I've got open right here. This is the Mead calculator. And here's where I sort of put in my information to get the recipe for that medium mead. So if my target volume is a 6-gallon batch, and I want my specific gravity. That D47 has an alcohol threshold of about maybe 12 to 14%. So I said, give me about a 13% alcohol by volume, and then calculate. Whoop! What did I do wrong? Oh, forgot to check this. Here we go. 13.5. Calculate. You can see it comes out to be a little bit over 17 pounds of honey. And then you can start to add additional sugars. So you can see these drop downs. If you're adding apples, apricots, blueberries, bananas, cashews, and it goes on down the list. Red currant. If you've ever had red currants, they're just really tart and they'll pucker you right up. But that was, without a doubt, probably the best mead I've ever made, and it's all gone now, but red currant mead is fantastic. My second favorite is rhubarb, and here's rhubarb as well. So you can put in things like this and how much you want to do, and here's the sugar content, 0.9%, and it will factor that into how much honey and everything else you're going to need to get your recipe. So this is a great resource, and it's got a help page to help take you through there. And so this is at Got Mead, and you can access it through our website. And plus, it's got a lot of other resources on here. Great resource. That calculator is a great way to sort of make up your own recipes using different fruits and things like that. So now let me go back over here and pull up my questions panel, and we'll try and get to as many questions as we can here. Let me just expand this out just a little bit and go up to the top. Let's see here. So this person talking about bottles, they're going to their local recycle center. There's no charge for them there. I know some recycle centers actually will charge you because they get paid for the glass depending on your location, and so they might charge you some nominal fee. If you know someone that owns a restaurant or something like that, talk to them about getting empty wine bottles because you're going to clean them up anyway. So that's a great resource there. My brother, his in-laws owned a place, and he got all the bottles he needed, and I got some of those as well. What is the average alcohol percentage of alcohol per batch? It's going to vary quite a bit depending on what you want. If you're making a dry mead, of course, you're not going to want any residual sugar, which means if you're using if you throw in, if we used in our recipe, if that yeast is going to ferment out everything, we're going to end up with about a 13.5% alcohol content. But it all depends on how much sugar, how much honey you're adding, and your yeast. I've produced one that had an alcohol content of 18%, which is really quite high. Most wines are down around sort of the 10-12% area. So it can vary quite a bit. Can you make the alcohol higher? Yes, depends a little bit on your yeast. You can also do what they call feed the fermentation. So what happens is sort of the natural selection process of the yeast reproduction is that as you get closer and closer to the threshold of that yeast, the yeasts that are remaining active are the ones that are able to tolerate alcohol closer to that threshold or even a little bit above. So if you just keep on dumping in just a little bit of honey, you'll keep selecting for that super yeast, if you will, and end up with a higher alcohol content. But the best way really is to select a yeast that will ultimately derive at the alcohol content you want. Let's see. Teaspoon of, did you put in, so this is a question about the teaspoon, hydrating the yeast. I guess I didn't specify that that's 2 teaspoons of honey that we're putting in with that. 2 teaspoons of honey to about a cup of water. What room temperature for fermentation process? Can temperature affect flavors? Absolutely. You want the temperature to be somewhere around 65 to 70 degrees is a good fermentation temperature. Too cold and it might slow it down. Too warm and you may begin to get some off flavoring. So right around that 65, 70 degree temperature is just about right. I've currently made my first 1 gallon batch of blueberry mead. It fermented very dry. Can I, or how would I, sweeten after finished fermentation? So you can add more honey. However, here's the thing, Kurt. If you have a yeast strain that is, let's say, for example, you added sufficient honey to create a 10% alcohol threshold, or 10% alcohol, but your yeast is capable of 14% alcohol. That would result in a very dry mead. Well, if now you add additional honey to it, you may begin to reinvigorate that yeast, and it may begin to ferment. And so rather than sweetening your mead, you may end up actually just essentially boosting your alcohol content. You can try adding a little bit of potassium sorbate, which retards the fermentation, but depending on how close you are to that threshold, will depend a little bit on how successful you are on that. So you got to be a little careful there. What's the difference between double and triple run meads? Honestly, I'm not quite sure. I know single equals sweet and high alcohol, triple lower alcohol and dry. But what are meant by the runs? Honestly, I've never heard of that, so I'm not quite sure. Does Brushy Mountain have starter kits? We've got the kit that I showed you in the slide right here. Pull that up. We've got the kit. Everything that you see in this picture, we've got. This is the kit that you would get. Obviously, the pop's not included, and the complete mead maker is not. But we've got that kit available. Yes. Can you age in the larger vessel? Yes, you can, and I encourage you to. From start to finish, how long a process, mixing to tasting? Well, Wayne, frankly, it's the tasting that we really care about, isn't it? Again, to make it, just the actual getting it into the fermenter, I figure about 2 hours. That's all the prep. That's getting out all my ingredients. That's getting everything. That's getting everything sort of sterilized and ready to go. About 2 hours, and then bottling the same. It's about 2 hours. I can usually I might be able to do it in about an hour and a half. And also, I might try and bottle up 2 or 3 batches at a time, and so I get some efficiency there. So we're up to 4 hours, and then racking it, maybe another 15 or so minutes for racking each time. So let's just say 5 hours total investment. Of course, that's not 5 hours all in one chunk. It's sort of spread out over the course of several months, depending on how long you're aging this in a carboy and before you bottle it, etc. But say about 5 hours, and it's well worth it. How do you prepare fruit, and when do you add it? Do you remove it at some point? So if you're making a fruit, you can either add it to the primary fermenter, or you can add it to the secondary fermenter. If you're going to add it to the primary fermenter, what you want to do is add something called a Camden tablet. A Camden tablet just helps sort of kill off any wild yeast that may be on that fruit. So you'd want, if you're adding it to the primary fermenter, you can sort of chop it up into small bits, put it in your, remember I use all glass, and so I'm putting all that fruit down this tiny little thing, so this tiny little neck of the carboy. So I need to cut it fairly small. If I'm doing it in the primary fermenter, add that Camden tablet. Again, I tend to cheat a little bit occasionally. There have been numerous times that I have not added a Camden tablet and just pitched my yeast right on it and come out fine. But technically speaking, the way to do it, most people would probably tell you to create your must, add your fruit, add the Camden tablets, at the dosage that's on the bottle. And usually you have to wait 24 hours before you pitch your yeast, and then pitch your yeast. If you're adding it to a secondary fermenter, you typically don't add a Camden tablet at that point because there's sufficient alcohol content that will retard the growth of those wild yeasts. Also, the yeast strain that you've used to create your mead is sufficiently established that it will overwhelm any of those wild yeasts and they won't become a factor. So there's two ways to do it, and depending on what your goal is, depends on whether you add it to the primary or secondary fermenters, that is. Let's see. I missed what you said what would help prevent cloudy mead. There's boiling the must. Boiling that honey water mixture helps with clarification. The other thing that you can use are those clarifying agents like the sparkleoid or the bentonite. Also, just time. And what you'll find too is that each time you rack your mead, you'll agitate it and you'll get new stuff precipitating out. So the more you rack it, the more successful you will be in ending up with a clear mead. Can you show your slide? Can you show your slide again for the equipment needed, or does Brushy Mountain sell a kit? So that's the slide that's up right now in the kit. Let's see. So that person's just hoping to get some honey. So this is from the Polish meads. This is going back to the first and third runs, etc. You know, it's interesting. The Europeans are way ahead of us, or I should say they never lost their fondness for mead or honey beverages. When I was at the Apamundia meeting in France, there was some of the best meads I have ever tasted, and I've actually brought a couple bottles back. They really know how to do it. I'll do a little research on that and see if I can't find out something. But I've never heard of that. Let's see. Racking. What is racking again? Racking is simply the transferring of the liquid from one fermentation vessel to another or to a bottling pail. It's just simply a fancy way of saying you're siphoning off the liquid from one big container into another big container. That's what racking is. Can you decanter out the cloudiness? So this is if you've got a little bit in your bottle. Absolutely. That's what I normally do. Is I just pour it real slow, try and leave behind a lot of the sediment that may remain in that bottle. It's a great way. It works just fine. Again, you know, unless I've got a really good one, I usually am not concerned with the competitions. I make it for my own production, family, friends. You know, I'm not worried about a little bit of cloudiness. I should also mention that producing your own wines, beers, meads, etc. is perfectly legal. I think the limit is you can only produce about 200 gallons per year per member of household. So generally speaking, most people don't come close to that. It's if you start to distill things, that's when the federal government gets a little bit agitated. But producing beer and wine is perfectly fine and within the realm of the law. Again, as long as you don't exceed or try and that maximum limit of 200 gallons, or you try and sell it. They take offense to that as well. They like to get their taxes off of the alcohol. Do you filter with cheesecloth? I don't filter with cheesecloth. The only time I might is if I'm pouring off the mead from some fruit or something like that. But normally that racking wand leaves behind any large particulate like that, either fruit, oak chips, something along those lines. And cheesecloth won't be sufficient to get the sort of sediment out that's going to create a little bit of haziness in the mead. So I don't really use cheesecloth too much. Can I explain the concept of producing a drier mead? It was something about if your yeast will work. Okay, so here's the thing. In our recipe, the D47 yeast, which is just the name they've given it, it's got an alcohol limit of about let's just say 14%. And so here, let's go back to our mead calculator. Here's our mead calculator. If I want a dry mead, I want that yeast to be able to utilize all the sugars in that solution. So I'm making a 6-gallon batch, and if my alcohol limit for the yeast is 14%, then I want to add sugar that would produce, if it were all used, something less than that. So in other words, my yeast is going to use up all the sugar. So I'm going to produce something, let's say 13%, and then let me check that box, and now I'm going to calculate. So I'm going to add just a little over 16 pounds of honey. So here with this recipe, my potential alcohol by volume is 13%. My yeast is capable of 14% alcohol, which means by the time it's done using all that sugar, it will not hit that sort of toxic level of alcohol in that solution. So it will result in a dry mead. Now, let's say I have, let's say I want 2% residual sugar, which would be a sweet mead. So I don't want a dry, I want a sweet. Well, I want, if my yeast is capable of 14%, but I want a sweet mead, which usually has about 2% residual sugar, I'll put in alcohol, my potential alcohol of 16%, and I'll calculate this. Now I'm going to want to add about 20.5 pounds of honey to get that sweet mead. That will leave behind about, my yeast is capable of 14%, but I've got enough sugar there. If everything were consumed, would produce 16%. Well, at 14, it goes toxic to my yeast. And so I'm going to end up with 2% residual sugar there. That's how you create your recipes to determine whether you are going to end up with a dry or a sweet or a semi-sweet. And again, it's not an exact science because this is assuming a sugar content of 79.6%. Well, honeys vary. Maybe you end up, I don't know, I haven't played with this calculator that much to know whether I can change this variable. Let's see. Let's see if I can change that. Try checking that. There we go. So here, if I added, if my sugar was 70%, now I'm down to 14, just over a little over 14% alcohol, so I might end up with a dry mead here. So, you know, there's a little bit of trial and error here, and unless you get really into this and start buying some expensive equipment to test your sugar content and things like that, it gets a little dicey. But that, as your specific gravity will help with this too, because your starting gravity here is correlated to your potential alcohol. You'll notice that when I change this back, this number right here should change. So let's go back to 79.6, and it did. So you can use the starting gravity to help you as well. All right. Let's see here. What tools are needed to test to get the numbers? Your starting gravity and your final gravity, all you need is that hydrometer. And let me go back to this. Let me find that. Let me find that picture. Here it is. Let me go back to this slide. Here's your hydrometer, and this is measuring a specific gravity about 1.15. And so here, if I go back to this, I can probably put in, let's see here, it's target starting gravity 1.15. Let's see what happens here. So here, uncheck that, calculate. I'm not sure if I'm doing this right, but I'm looking at a potential, if everything were consumed, I'm looking at a potential alcohol level of about 19%. In this case, I'm thinking, I can't exactly remember what batch of mead I was making here, but I think I was going for obviously a high alcohol mead with a champagne yeast that's got about an 18% alcohol threshold. So that's that batch there. That's all the questions I've got. So we've gone over a little bit. I appreciate y'all attending. If you haven't made mead, go out and buy a couple of bottles, find some, talk to your beekeeper friends, see if they've got some you can try. But don't stop with just one bottle. Try several. The quality and flavors will vary, and you might find one that you like. And then if you find that it is something you enjoy, it's fairly easy to actually get started, and it's a great way to utilize a lot of your surplus honey. So thank you very much for attending. I appreciate it, and we hope to see you on the next one.